everybody, and welcome back to my channel. Today is April 7th, which is the anniversary of my legal name change. So I thought I would tell you guys a story of how I came to change my name and why I picked the name I did. Now during the telling of this story, I'm going to tell you what my old name was. And I should say that that is something you shouldn't ask other trans people. For me, it's a little painful to remember what it was, but for some other trans people, it can be downright traumatic. And if you think about it, it makes total sense. I mean, that old name represented a life that was holding them prisoner. It's not something you would want to remember either. And asking them what their old name was won't tell you anything about who they are now. We call it our dead name for a reason because we'd rather it be buried in the past. And I know many of you may have asked a trans person what their old name was, and in fact a lot of people have asked me that themselves. But I hope you can see why many of us would rather not recall it. Now, as you may have noticed, my first name is Melody and my middle name is Maya, but I actually go by my middle name, which is kind of a funny thing when you think about it because I named myself. My old first name was Domingo. It's kind of an old Spanish name, and I was actually the third. My father had the same name I did, and he was Junior. So together with my ex-wife, we actually started going through first name choices, and we hit upon Melody for two reasons. The first is that I'm a singer. The second is that almost nobody called me by my full first name anyway. Most people took the lead from my ex-wife, who used to call me Dee. So I thought it was pretty smart to pick a name, Melody, where you could still continue to call me Dee, and it would still make sense. I mean, after all, Dee really isn't a very masculine first name either. As for Maya, I spell it a little differently, M-A-I-A. And there is a reason for that. See, back in my freshman year of Princeton, we all had to pass this weird thing they called the floating test, where we had to float in water for 15 minutes. I remember sitting poolside waiting to get into the pool when this absolutely beautiful girl walked in. And I remember thinking, wow, I wish I was her. I mean, she had everything. She had beauty, and obviously she had brains because she was a Princeton undergraduate. But I also came to find out that she had a beautiful name, and it was Maya. And she spelled Maya, M-A-I-A, which with the Spanish pronunciation of those letters is Ma-I-A. So put it all together and you get Maya. And I always thought to myself that if I was lucky enough to have a daughter in the future, I'd call her Maya. Instead, I ended up taking the name for myself. Now, once I was living as full-time me, it became pretty important to legally change my name. In fact, even more important than changing my sex marker on my ID, because that little M and that little F are tiny. Most people don't even pay attention to that marker because they take you at face value. And more things were happening every day that were a little embarrassing. Like if I got on a plane, the TSA would look at my ID and see this name that didn't match the person in front of them. Or sometimes I would go to a restaurant and the waitress would come back with a credit card, look down at the name, and then kind of scan the table to figure out who it belonged to. And at that point I had to out myself and raise my hand and say, yeah, that one's mine. Even worse was the time I went to my local police department to get fingerprinted because I had to get a background check in order to get my legal name changed. So sitting in a waiting room with all these people, and this woman sticks her head out the door and like screams out my old name, Domingo, Domingo, to the entire lobby. Yeah, that was really not cool. So one day I got all the forms I needed from the state of Florida to legally change my name. I then submitted it and waited for a court date and presented myself at the courthouse on that day. And I was very nervous because I would actually have to present myself in front of a judge. I remember walking in feeling very small and very meek and just sitting there. And I think the judge took a little bit of pity on me. He only asked me one question. He said, was I changing my name to kind of escape any sort of legal decision? I said no, and with one rubber stamp, he changed my life. I took that court order and sat outside that courtroom on a bench for about 40 minutes just staring down at it. I could not believe that it had happened. It was so profound and I didn't know exactly how to process that. Think about every place that your name appears. I was still living with my mom at the time after my divorce, and so I walked into the house kind of still stunned. And I looked at my mom and told her I'd legally changed my name, and she looked back at me and said, you killed the last Domingo. You see, my father had passed the previous May, and it had given me the courage to actually pursue transition. And as cruel as it was, what my mom said I know came from a place of grief and sorrow. But what she said next really twisted the knife. She said, I want to adopt a new little boy and give him your old name to replace you. And even though I've forgiven my mom and we've patched things up, I'll never forget them. So slowly over the next coming weeks, I started getting things like debit cards in my new name, and I felt a new kind of freedom, which is what allowed me to pursue things like getting a job. And after I changed nearly everything, including my college diploma, I decided to change my birth certificate. It was the very last thing, and I hadn't changed it to that point because I'd gotten rejected once before by the city of New York. When I had first done it, they required all kinds of extensive documentation, not just a court order and a letter from my surgeon. They wanted wanted a surgery report, which I thought was really invasive. They wanted to know exactly what had been done to me. Later, the city of New York was able to amend those rules, and I was able to get my name changed with that surgery letter and some forms I had to fill out. I sent them away and then forgot about them until one day in the mail I got a large envelope, and in the middle of it was my birth certificate, my new birth certificate. And what it said was that on my birthday in the city of New York, a little girl named Melody Maia was born. Transgender people, we often say that we were assigned male at birth or we were assigned female at birth, and that's to indicate our birth sex that a doctor assigned to us, but not actually how we see ourselves. But when I looked down at that birth certificate, I realized I had changed that now I was assigned female at birth. I was able to reach back through time and correct a historical record, and that was much more powerful than I realized. I hope you like that story. I know I reflect on it every April 7th, and I will probably for the rest of my life. So, like, share, and subscribe, and see you around the interwebs.